Well, hello everybody. It's a great pleasure to get to join you. Um, it would be more fun, of course, to be there in person. But one of the things the last year has taught us is that we're able to travel effectively by modem and mouse some of the time. And in a world that needs to save on carbon, not the worst lesson to be learning. Let me give you my background just really quickly. I sort of wear two hats when it comes to working on the climate crisis. One, I'm a writer. I wrote the first book about what we then called the greenhouse effect back in 1989, a book called The End of Nature. And I also am an activist. I founded 350.org about 15 years ago, and it was the first iteration of a global grassroots climate change campaign, now happily joined by many, many others: Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for the Future, on and on and on, and what may now be the kind of largest mega movement that the planet's seen. And thank heaven, because it's coming just in time if it is in time. Let me try and set the context of where we are right now. Um, because, well, because it's the story of our century. When I wrote that first book about climate change back in 1989, we knew most of what we needed to know. Basically, that burning coal and gas and oil puts carbon in the atmosphere, and its molecular structure traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. What we didn't know then was exactly how fast and how hard it would pinch. Scientists, as it turns out, are conservative by nature, and they somewhat underestimated just how fast things were going to go. So the upheavals we're seeing at the moment are really what we thought would happen 30, 40, 50 years down the road. But it turned out to be a very finely balanced system. And we turn out to be putting a lot of extra heat in it. So far, human beings have raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree Celsius, which doesn't sound like that much. If it was, 15 degrees when you walked out the door this morning and 16 degrees when you walked out of your office, you wouldn't notice the difference. But the planet can notice the difference. Put in different units, the amount of heat that we trap each day because of the carbon we've put in the atmosphere is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima sized bombs. And when you think about it in those terms, you understand how we have produced enough heat to, say, melt most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic. I mean, that's a continent sized, millennia old, meters thick sheet of ice, and most of it's gone. That takes a lot of heat. So many things take a lot of heat, and we can see them playing out already at this 1 degree Celsius level. There have been enormous shifts in the hydrological cycle of the planet, the way that water moves around the Earth. That's why in arid, dry areas, we see more evaporation. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. If you wanted one fact just to understand the 21st century, that might be it. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That evaporation produces drought with high heat. It sets the table for the kind of massive wildfires that we see now. If 2020 hadn't been the year of the coronavirus, it would have been the year of the conflagration. From Australia to Siberia to the west coast of the United States to the Pantanal, the largest wetland in the world in South America, we saw fires on a scale that we've never seen before. Once that water is evaporated up into the atmosphere, it comes down. And that's why we see flooding and rainfall on scales that we've never seen before, at least since Noah. The amount of rain dropping on the planet in big, big bursts that cause extraordinary flooding is epic now. In the Atlantic, we just went through the largest hurricane season in history. And as always, the pain of these climate events is visited on those who did the least to cause them. The iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. So look at the end of that hurricane season. The last two storms of the year, and we were deep into the Greek alphabet by that time, Eta and Iota crashed into Honduras, where they did damage equivalent to something like 40% of the GDP. By contrast, Katrina, the worst storm ever to hit the US, my country, did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. So that gives you some sense of who's taking it in the neck as we move into this global warming era. So the disturbing thing is that 1 degree that we've raised the temperature so far and that has caused this kind of destabilization is only the beginning. We're on a path at the moment, even if countries kept the promises they'd made in Paris to raise the temperature of the planet 3 degrees Celsius, maybe a little more by the end of the century. If that happens, I think the I think that the consensus among scientists and others is pretty clear that we will not be able to have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. That is too much change, too fast, too chaotic. We're understanding now that we're beginning to undermine even just most basic things like the way that the Gulf Stream uh, brings heat from the tropics north. Um, or the way that the chemistry of the ocean allows the production of the bottom of the biological food chain. Monkeying around with these things in the way that we are is, well, it's the greatest danger we've ever faced. That's why in Paris, countries set their minds to a target of under 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible for a rise in temperature. If we meet that target, it won't be good. I mean, 1 degree is already extraordinarily difficult to deal with. 1.5 or 2 degrees will be worse, and not twice as bad, probably worse than that, because the change is exponential now, not linear as we pass tipping points. But it's possible that it will be survivable on a civilizational scale. That's why this is so important. And in order to meet anything like those targets, we have to move with extraordinary speed. So, again, here's the other parameter. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, our authorities on all of this, in their last report, which was in October of 2018, said that if the world had not fundamentally transformed its energy system by 2030, and they helpfully defined fundamentally transform as reduce emissions by half. If we don't do that by 2030, then the chances of meeting those targets we set in Paris are essentially nil. So that's the challenge. How do we make that kind of massive transformation in a very short period of time? I've given you a lot of bad news, and we give you a couple of pieces of good news, both concerning developments over the last decade. The first is that the engineers really have done their job. Over the last decade, they've dropped the price of solar power and wind power by an order of magnitude, by 90%. It costs a tenth as much as it did in 2010. That's an extraordinary shift. And what it means is that there's no longer any economic obstacle to making change at the pace we need to make it. It's the cheapest way to generate power over most of the world. And we now know how to take that electricity and use it to do things like drive electric cars and electric buses, run air source heat pumps and induction cooktops that replace gas or wood or peat or whatever else we've been burning. We could do this. It would take an extraordinary effort, comparable to the ones that countries put in at the start of World War II, but not beyond the range of technical possibility. We're obviously not doing it at that rate yet. And the reason for that is that the extraordinary power of the fossil fuel industry, the greatest vested interest we've ever had in this world, has prevented us from making change. For a long time, they prevented us from making change by simply lying, by bankrolling the biggest attempted deception that the world's ever seen, this massive architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that muddied the waters around climate change. That effort's mostly over. I mean, it's impossible at this point to go on denying climate change because too many people have seen the pictures. I think that overt climate denial got on the airplane with Donald Trump to go to Mar-a-Lago, and I don't think it's coming back. Um, that said, the forces of delay and half-heartedness and things are just as strong and just as dangerous. The fossil fuel industry now is playing just to extend its business model another 20 or 30 years. But if they succeed in doing that, that'll be time enough to break the planet because we have to make the shift much, much, much faster. So the other good news of the last 20 years, 10 years, 20 years, is that there's arisen this series of movements that do serve as a counterbalance to the power of the fossil fuel industry. That's why so many of us have been in the streets and in jail over the last decade, trying to block pipelines, trying to move money, trying to make life difficult for the fossil fuel industry so that we can get on with this change that we need to make. And it's here that we need everybody participating and helping. There are a number of things that can be done, and to one degree or another, they're starting to be done by different governments. Um, we're beginning to see governments move really rapidly, including in the UK, to build out renewable energy. Big offshore wind turbine farms are a great example. Not everything that pretends to be green is green. One of the best examples in the UK is the giant wood burning um, palace that Drax has built um, that takes wood chips, many of them shipped from the United States, and burns them to generate power. This is a stupid idea because it releases a great pulse of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at precisely the worst moment. And yes, theoretically, it may be soaked up in 40 or 50 years as those forests grow, but we don't have that 40 or 50 years. So we need to move towards true renewable energy, wind and sun, and hydropower just as fast as we possibly can. Um, we need to stop new fossil fuel infrastructure everywhere we can. In the US, people are fighting to make sure that there aren't new gas hookups for new homes and buildings, that instead they are forced to move quickly to electricity. People are even blocking the construction of new gas stations on the argument that we're not going to have internal combustion engines much longer, and it's stupid to keep building new infrastructure. On the macro level, this looks like stopping LNG export terminals and on and on and on, new ones from being built because you don't want to get any further down this path any more locked in. In general, our mantra has to be don't don't burn anything that you possibly can avoid burning, and definitely don't build anything new that connects to a flame. Take full advantage of the fact that God put a large flame 93 million miles away, and we have the ingenuity to take advantage of the light it sheds with solar panels and of the wind that it produces by differential heating on the planet with big wind turbines. And that should be the way that we figure out quickly how to generate power. There are other ways that people have come up with to try and even this fight between the fossil fuel industry and the future. One of the most important of them has been to put real economic pressure on the fossil fuel industry. We've done this in a couple of ways. One is this big divestment movement to get institutions to sell their um, investments and holdings in the fossil fuel industry. And this has turned into the largest campaign of its kind in history. We're now at about $15 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel, including a lot of educational institutions, including in the UK, some of the, Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh. thing, Trinity. Um, um, it's incredibly important. Shell Oil said last year that divestment had become a material risk to its business, which is good because Shell Oil's business is a material risk to life on planet Earth. This needs to keep expanding. Your neighbors to the south in the Republic of Ireland have divested all public accounts from fossil fuel industry. That's really remarkable work, as has been their commitment against any new oil and gas exploration on or offshore and so on. So there are plenty of good examples of that kind of work. The divestment campaign is being joined now by a similar effort to put pressure on big banks, insurance companies, and asset managers in order to get them to break their ties with the fossil fuel industry. In the UK, Barclays is the biggest offender, and there are big active campaigns to try and bring them to a new place. Um, the money that one puts on deposit in a bank shouldn't be used to fund the destruction of the future. But it is. The banks taken together have lent trillions of dollars to the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Climate Accords. It didn't take Donald Trump to sabotage them. It turns out we were quite capable of doing it just with the money that the financial system has sloshing around. So, taken together, that I think is a reasonable depiction of the crisis in which we find ourselves. We face the greatest challenge that we've ever faced as a species. We have a short period of time in which to solve it. We have the technology at hand in order to solve it. We have to address the political and economic imbalances that keep us from moving as quickly as we need to go. That's the way that it all crumbles out here. I can't tell you how it's going to come out. The reason is this element of time. It's not like the normal political challenges and questions that we face. In those questions, the impetus is always towards some kind of compromise. You have your position, someone else says theirs, you meet someplace in the middle, you come back and argue it out again in a few more years and move a little further down. That's what progress looks like. That's how human societies change best, when they change slowly and gradually. But that's not the situation that we face here. The contest ultimately is not between different groups of human beings. The contest ultimately is between human beings on the one hand and physics and chemistry on the other. Physics and chemistry don't compromise and they don't negotiate. Our job is to meet the dictates that they've set. And that's why we're in such a difficult fix. And that's why it's so important that all of us figure out how to take an active part in that fight. Indeed, to go outside our comfort zone. Um, I wish I could tell you that making individual changes in your life would be sufficient to do the work here, but I can't. In the time that we have left, we're not going to solve this one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. Those things are very helpful. I'm very proud of the solar panels all over my roof. That's how I'm talking to you today. But I don't try to fool myself that that's how we're going to make the change we need to make. The most important thing that an individual can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to change the basic political and economic ground rules fast enough to matter. We got great gifts from the 20th century: the invention of solar panels, but also the invention of nonviolent social movements, the work that came from the suffragists, from Gandhi, from Dr. King, from all the people whose names we don't know, and that allow us to imagine the small and the many standing up to the mighty and the few. In this case, the stakes of that have never been higher. And that's why it's a real pleasure to get to talk with you and to say that I hope very much that you will be part of this change that must happen. Thank you so much.